Welcome to Eastern Oregon Bigfoot Stories, or Eastern Oregon BS. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have a Bigfoot story to share with us, or any story for that matter of the strange or unexplained, please email me at easternoregonbs@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Our first story comes from Richard, and this happened on his family's farm in central New York near Lake Cayuga. Now, Lake Cayuga is one of the Finger Lakes. American Indian lore says that the creator left his hand imprint in the land, creating these Finger Lakes. So Richard tells this story. His grandparents were in the main farmhouse, but the family had houses within a mile of each other. There was a creek that ran on the west side of the farm. They had many acres of land and 275 milk cows, so Richard had chores and such. He grew up in the 60s and he went to a country school with all 12 grades. It was the spring of 1979 and I was plowing a field for my uncle. You know how you're always looking behind you watching the moldboard? Well, I was doing that and I could feel I was in the furrow with the front tire of my tractor. Close to the end of the field, where I'd turn around, there was a rock that my great-grandfather had pulled out of the field with mules. The rock was about 8 to 10 feet around and 5.5 to 6 feet tall. I saw there, standing next to the rock, a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Based on the rock size, the Sasquatch stood about 7 to 8 feet tall. I saw breasts that were mostly covered in hair, and it looked almost exactly like what you'd see in the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. She had a conical head, but not as pronounced as Patty's. She had a little bit of a crown on the back of her head. The hair on her head was actually shorter than the hair on the rest of her body. It reminded me of Joyce DeWitt's hairstyle from the old TV show Three's Company, only maybe it was a little longer. From the time it took me on the tractor to start at the top of the field until I got down where the goalie was, she had to have been standing there watching for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. She had a look of, what the heck is that? It's when I stopped the tractor, pushed the clutch in and took it out of gear, that she actually noticed me. She had the expression on her face as if she were thinking, oh, there's somebody on that thing. I was within 100 feet of her, but I did not feel intimidated in any way. There was no fear. I was not scared. I was in awe. I just sat there looking at her. She had her own distinct beauty. She had the most beautiful amber eyes. Her hair wasn't fur, it was hair, and it was glossy or shiny, like she had just stepped out of the shower. And it looked meticulously well kept. It was a deep chocolate brown color. The hair was all over with the exception of her face. Where her facial features were, there was not very much hair. There was some around her chin and on her head. She had hair starting just below her lower lip, but not as heavy as the rest of her body. Her nose was like Patty's nose and full lips. She never showed her teeth. I couldn't see ears, or I didn't notice them. She had hands that would dwarf my hands. Her hands made mine look like a child's. There was also hair on the back of them, but not on her palms. She didn't smell bad like you hear some people say in other encounters. There was no unpleasant odor at all. And I've taken the wind direction into account, which usually blows from the west and rarely from the east. She stood there and looked at me. Then, with one of the most graceful moves I've ever seen, she turned and went over the goalie bank in a fluid motion. She had turned to her left, so I got a good view of her front, to her right side, to her rear end. I saw a butt crack. She had muscles on top of muscles, more than I could ever think of having. I can't think of anything that describes the grace and mobility of her going up and over that goalie bank. For myself, at 20 years old, it would have been an effort for me. I jumped off the tractor and ran maybe 15 feet to the edge of the goalie bank, and she was gone. There were trees on down to the creek, but it's not so thick that you can't see. but she was gone. She made absolutely no noise. I don't remember a rustling of leaves or anything. She was very stealthy. I didn't think anything could be that quiet in the woods. I would squirrel hunt and deer hunt all the time down there, and as a kid, you always had the feeling of somebody watching you. My grandmother would always tell us to leave an offering to the people in the woods, but we never really sat down and discussed it. So when I would get 2 or 3 squirrels, I would leave one, or when we deer hunted, we would leave the heart and liver, which I didn't like to eat anyway. We'd leave those on a log. I learned this from a young age. I spent a lot of time in the woods around the farm, and if I wasn't hunting squirrels or deer, I was fishing. I never did find any caves or shelters in the woods or anything like that I noticed. I remember picking or chopping corn, and sometimes we would find that some corn had been picked right off the stalk already. We would also have a calf come up missing once in a while. The only predators around were bobcats. No wolves, no bears, no mountain lions. There weren't even coyotes back then, but now there are. The whole idea of Sasquatch or Bigfoot was not ever talked about or discussed in the family or with anyone in the area. The subject was what you might call taboo. It's just not something that was talked about. We did, however, once in a while hear stories about the bear in the area, which is what the farmers around called it. But everyone knew full well that there wasn't a bear in our area and hadn't been in over 100 years. Though it wasn't talked about, a lot of folks knew what was going on. At dinner time, when we all ate around the table, was the only time we talked about things. Once in a while, I'd hear something there. Like my grandpa would say, "Yeah, I saw that thing too." I never put it together until I was older, though. Sometimes, while sitting on the porch, we would hear things. One time, my grandmother, little sister, and I were on the front porch, and we heard a scream. My grandmother told us it was a bobcat. There was a smaller creek by my grandmother's house that ran into the big creek. The creek would run between 2 fields. I remember hearing screaming, and it sounded like it was moving down the creek bed. Then you'd hear a knock, then nothing. There was a farmer north of us on the opposite side of the creek, and he had taken Polaroid pictures of a Sasquatch. I don't remember what he was doing when he saw it, but he saw the Sasquatch walking across his field. He snapped 2 pictures of it, one right after the other. And my mom worked at a restaurant, and this farmer brought these pictures in and showed them to the locals, including my mom. I got to see them too. They were black and white, and it looked like the Sasquatch was just leisurely strolling through this farmer's cornfield from one woodline to the other. Unfortunately, though, this farmer got a lot of ridicule, even though he and his family were some of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. And he had proof in hand. I don't know what happened to the pictures, but they would have been gold now. My uncle also said that he saw a Sasquatch when I was 13 or 14 years old. He had rented a property north of the farm to bale hay, and he saw one walk from the back of a barn into the woods. Right after my encounter with the female Sasquatch, I got back home and walked in the house. My mom asked, "How was your day?" I said, "Fine," but I shied away, and she noticed. She said, "What's going on? When you're this quiet, I know something's up." She said, "We need to sit down." So we did, and I told her everything. Then she said, "Richie, you and me are the only ones who's going to know about this. I don't want you telling anybody." And I didn't tell anyone outside my family or the public for 46 years until I had got the okay from my mom to talk about it. My mom was a very special lady, and when she told you not to do something, you didn't do it. For me to carry that for over 40 years, that says a lot about my mom. I consider her giving me the okay to talk about it in the end as her gift to me. I take everything for what its value is at the time. That moment in time and that experience or encounter that I had with the female Sasquatch is something I will cherish until the day I die. It's one of the best things that's happened to me in my life. Most people don't get to experience what you and I have. And that's his story. But Richard and I got to talking, and he told me another experience that he had that is not a Bigfoot experience, but it's super interesting, and I think you guys are going to want to hear it. So I asked him for permission to tell it on here, so here's his second story. Around 1987 or 88, in Virginia, me and a friend were fishing at Herring Lake near the James River. The only way to fish this lake is by boat with an electric motor. We were just sitting there fishing away, and all of a sudden, we hear this buzzing or humming sound. My friend said, "What the bleep is that?" Then this huge silver ball, 40 foot around if not bigger, came over the top of the trees and dipped down over the lake, almost touching the water, then shot straight up. When it came down to the lake, I bet you it wasn't a foot off the water. If you took stainless steel and polished it until it was mirror bright, that's what this thing looked like. 2 F15 Eagles were chasing it. They went supersonic straight up chasing this thing out of sight. My friend and I sat there looking at each other. I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, "What did we just see?" I replied, "I have no idea." This happened around the same time people spotted all those rectangular things over Virginia. The next 2 stories took place in Eastern Oregon. They're family stories that were passed down to me, and these are things that my great-grandparents experienced. My great-grandpa spent a lot of time in the mountains, and he loved mining. He would go around drilling holes in the ground to find ore, gold, or anything, and he went inside copper mines. He was very interested in mines. So my grandma married my grandpa, and then her family started hunting where my grandpa would hunt over in the mountains above his ranch. My great-grandpa thought these mountains were weird because you would be hunting and just run into a cabin and then never be able to find that cabin again. You would also find mine shafts, and same thing. I'm going to take a minute to say I can attest to this because I grew up hunting in these mountains and exploring, and you definitely run into mine shafts just out of the blue, or an old cabin that's maybe barely standing or partially collapsed. So yeah, it's a thing. But back to the story. One day, my great-grandpa and his crew were hunting up in these mountains, and they said they could sense something was present near them. Something was paralleling them, and then maybe a little ahead of them, walking faster than them. They could see the path of something very tall which had walked through the brush and trees. The snow had been brushed off the trees 10 feet high. They found footprints on the road, and they looked like they had been made by a man's feet that had been wrapped in burlap. That's how they described it. On to the next story. There was a mother lode mine near my great-grandma and grandpa's house above the fork in the road. There were many stories of a light coming from the area of the mine, and several people claimed to have seen it on different occasions. It was different because the light was a steady moving light. It did not bounce up and down like someone carrying a flashlight, and it would just come closer and closer at a steady pace. One time, my great-grandma and grandpa had a crew up there, and the men left during the day and the women were alone at camp. They said it got dark and the women saw the light. It scared them pretty bad. It was a steady light that came closer and closer. By the time the men came back, the light was gone, and they didn't believe the women. That's it for today, but we have many more stories to share, so be sure to tune in to our next episode of Eastern Oregon BS.